I live in a small apartment on the east side of Portland. 1 bedroom, a narrow balcony, and just enough space for me, my desk, and the quiet hum of my computer. Most nights, the room glows with the cold blue light from my monitors, and there's a pair of headphones resting on the hook beside them. Those headphones, my gaming headset, aren't fancy, but they were mine. I bought them after 3 months of saving, skipping takeout lunches, saying no to weekend beers with friends. $120 might not mean much to some people, but to me, it was a decision. A little promise to myself that if I worked hard enough, I could afford something that made my world sound just a bit clearer. I'd work remotely, tech support for a software company, and the headset's mic is basically my voice to the world. I take calls, talk customers through their problems, switch over to Discord at night to play with friends. When I put those headphones on, I can disappear. The city fades out. The traffic, the neighbors, the dull buzz of loneliness, and all that's left is the sound of voices, the echo of laughter, the low rumble of digital worlds that somehow feel more real than my own. That headset has been through everything with me. Late night projects, heartbreaks, deadlines, insomnia. It's seen me at 3 a.m., half awake, whispering to friends across the country about dreams and fears I'd never admit out loud. It was more than plastic and wire. It was a doorway, a small piece of comfort that said, you're still connected, even when you're alone. I met Rachel 2 years ago, right before winter. She was 23, still in grad school, studying social psychology. We met through mutual friends, a game night that turned into coffee, that turned into something that felt like gravity. She had this wild energy, the kind of person who made the air around her hum. She laughed loudly, talked fast, and always had her hair tied up like she was ready to run somewhere at any moment. I liked that about her, that restless, untamed spark. I'd been quiet most of my life, deliberate, the kind of guy who folds receipts before throwing them away. Rachel was chaos. Beautiful, messy, intoxicating chaos. When she came over, my apartment stopped feeling like a storage unit for one person's life and started to feel like a place where life actually happened. She'd light candles I didn't know I owned, play music through my speakers while cooking, dance in the kitchen barefoot, spilling wine on the counter like it was part of the choreography, and me. I just watched. I'd sit at my desk, headset hanging beside me, pretending to work while my heart felt a little less heavy. Rachel wasn't the kind of person who cared much for things. Her phone always had a cracked screen. Her keys were never in the same place twice. She'd leave coffee mugs everywhere, on the bookshelf, next to the sink, sometimes on top of the fridge. She said, objects aren't memories. People are. I used to think that was poetic, maybe even wise, but over time, I realized it also meant she never really took care of anything she owned. Not out of malice, just ... detachment. Meanwhile, I came from the opposite kind of life. I grew up with parents who counted every dollar, fixed things instead of replacing them. My dad had this old stereo he kept running for 20 years by soldering the same loose wire every few months. So yeah, maybe I cared too much about stuff. But for me, things represented effort, sacrifice. They were small monuments to hard work. When Rachel moved in temporarily for a few weeks, her apartment was being fumigated. I didn't think twice. I wanted her here. The space felt fuller with her around, even when she was messy. But somewhere between her scattered energy and my quiet order, tension began to simmer, small things. almost invisible at first, like the way she'd drop her bag right in front of the door every time she came in, or how she'd borrow my charger, then forget it under a pile of clothes, or how she'd laugh when I asked her to use a coaster. Little cracks. Nothing big. Until one morning, one very ordinary morning, something did break. It was a Saturday. The kind of grey, half-rainy morning that Portland specializes in. Soft drizzle, the smell of wet asphalt, distant sirens. I woke up early, made coffee, and sat at my desk to check some work messages. Rachel was still asleep. She'd been out late with friends the night before, and I didn't want to wake her. My headset was on the chair, not hanging on the hook, but lying across the seat, the way I'd left it after a late-night game session. I remember glancing at it, meaning to move it. But then my phone buzzed, and I got distracted. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps, slow, drowsy, the sound of someone still half in a dream. Then came the sound, a crunch, a small, sharp snap that somehow echoed louder than it should have. I turned around, and there she was, standing over the chair, frozen, one hand over her mouth. My headset lay crushed beneath her. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she said, her voice breaking into a nervous laugh. I didn't see it there. I stared at it, one ear cup bent. The plastic headband split down the middle like a broken wishbone. For a second, everything went quiet. The rain outside, the hum of the computer, even my breath. All I could hear was the faint, impossible ringing of that sound. I wasn't angry. Not yet, just ... stunned. Then I heard myself say, half under my breath, "Damn it. It's broken. I'll have to buy a new one." Rachel looked at me and smiled awkwardly, maybe to lighten the mood. "Well," she said, "guess you'll get an upgrade, huh?" She laughed. I didn't, and in that tiny pause, something inside me shifted. I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my voice. But something about her reaction, the way she brushed it off like it was nothing, hit a nerve I didn't know I had. It wasn't about the headset, not really. It was about what it represented. That headset had been with me through long nights, loneliness, every late call that paid for our dinners and the small trips she loved. And in 1 second, it was gone, and she laughed. I remember thinking, if I broke something that mattered to her, I'd offer to fix it, or at least say, "I'm sorry." But Rachel didn't. She just ruffled my hair, said, "Don't pout," and went to pour herself coffee. And I just sat there, watching her, the broken headset in my hands, realizing that maybe we weren't hearing the same frequency after all. When Emma left that night, I told myself it was nothing, just a stupid misunderstanding about a headset. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of my PC fans and the hollow buzz of silence that fills your head when you've been thinking too long. My headset sat on the desk, broken, like a physical reminder of how fragile things could be. Not just plastic, but people, relationships, trust. I reached over, picked it up again, turning it in my hands. The crack wasn't big, but it ran through the plastic ear cup like a scar. The kind of scar that never truly heals, just smooths over time, until you almost forget how it got there. The mic still dangled uselessly. When I tried to plug it in again, it made that soft click, but no sound came through. I don't know why it mattered so much. It wasn't just the money. It was what the whole moment meant. Emma hadn't apologized, not really. She hadn't even seemed sorry. She laughed. She brushed it off, like breaking something that mattered to me wasn't worth the emotional effort of caring. The next day, she texted me late in the afternoon. "Emma, hey, you okay? You seemed kinda off last night." Me, "Yeah, just tired." Emma, "Okay, good." That was it. No mention of the headset. No mention of the conversation that followed. And I didn't bring it up again, not because I'd moved on, but because I could feel that invisible line between us hardening. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many little cracks had already been there before that night. Emma and I had been together for almost a year. We met through a mutual friend at a bar. Cliché, I know, but she was the kind of girl who made clichés feel new again. She had this energy, this laugh that drew people in. When she laughed, it wasn't quiet or polite. It was loud, full-bodied, the kind that made heads turn. And she was beautiful in that natural, unbothered way, like she never tried too hard but somehow always looked incredible. I was the opposite. I'm the kind of guy who checks his reflection in the microwave door before a Zoom call. I plan conversations before they happen. I overthink texts. Emma, she just lived. That difference was exciting at first. She made me feel lighter, more spontaneous. But over time, those differences turned from sparks into friction. I wanted stability. She wanted flow. I wanted plans. She wanted vibes. And now, I wanted an apology. A few days later, she came over again. I was playing Apex Legends when she walked in, the broken headset sitting on my desk like a ghost from last week, still mad about the headset. She said casually, tossing her bag on the couch. "I'm not mad," I said, pausing my game. "Just disappointed, I guess." She rolled her eyes. "God, you sound like my dad." That hit harder than it should have. "Wow, okay." "No, I mean," she sighed. "Look, it was an accident, babe. I didn't mean to break it. What do you want me to do? Punish myself over it? I just thought maybe you'd offer to replace it," I said carefully. She frowned, genuinely confused. "It's just a headset. You make good money. You'll get another one." I took a deep breath. "It's not about the money, Emma. It's about," she cut me off, "you and your stuff. You care about things too much." Her words felt sharp, like they were meant to pierce something deeper. I didn't respond. I just sat there, staring at the cracked plastic dot after a long silence. She sat down next to me, brushing my arm lightly. "Hey," she said softly. "Don't be mad, okay? I'll make it up to you. I'll buy you dinner." Dinner. That was her version of balance. Later that night, we sat across from each other at a small Thai restaurant we both liked. The lighting was warm and low, the kind that makes everyone look softer than they really are. She was scrolling through her phone between bites, showing me random memes and half-laughing before I could even react. I nodded, smiled when I could. But something in me had shifted, not enough to end things, but enough to see things differently. There's a moment in every relationship where you start seeing patterns. The things you ignored because you were in love now start to connect like constellations. That night, I realized something. Emma didn't like to be uncomfortable. She avoided guilt the way I avoided conflict. When she finally looked up from her phone, she noticed my silence. "You're quiet," she said. "Just thinking," I replied. "About the headset." I almost laughed. "No, about us." Her expression changed, that subtle tightening around her eyes. "What about us?" I looked down at my drink. Do you think we're good? Like really good? She smiled faintly, like she thought it was cute that I worried. Yeah, we're fine. But fine isn't good. Fine is a slow fade, not a spark. Fine is the word people use when they're trying to end a conversation, not fix one. That night, when we got back to my place, she fell asleep easily, curled up on her side of the bed. I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. My mind kept replaying the same thought, that the headset wasn't just a headset anymore. It was a symbol of how differently we treated responsibility, empathy, and care. To her, it was a small thing that didn't matter. To me, it was proof that when something broke, even by accident, she didn't believe in repair. The next week, I ordered a new headset online. It was slightly better, with a built-in noise-cancelling mic and softer ear cushions. It cost about $140, not a huge difference, but enough to feel like a step up. When it arrived, I unboxed it carefully, the way I always do with tech. The smell of new plastic, the clean matte finish, small pleasures that people like Emma would never understand. I set it up, plugged it in, and for a while, everything felt quiet again. Emma came over that weekend. When she saw the new headset, she smirked. See, I told you it worked out. You got an upgrade. I smiled weakly. Yeah, I guess. But inside, something twisted. It wasn't the headset that mattered anymore. It was the realization that I'd learned more about us from something she broke than from anything we'd ever built. That night, after she left, I recorded a voice memo for myself, something I'd started doing recently when I needed to think out loud. You ever realize a fight isn't about what it's about? I said quietly into the mic, like, the headset isn't the problem. It's how people respond to problems that tells you who they are. She doesn't fix things. She moves past them. I fix things. I hold on. I stopped recording, sat there in the dark, listening to the sound of my own breathing. That was when I realized relationships don't break from one big moment. They break from 1,000 little ones that we refuse to admit mattered. And for us, it started with a broken piece of plastic. A few weeks passed. The headset story became one of those quiet things between us. Never mentioned, never forgotten. It hung there, invisible but heavy, like humidity before a storm. We still saw each other. We still laughed, went out for drinks, watched Netflix late into the night. But something about the way she looked at me had changed. Or maybe it was the way I looked at her. Every time she brushed her hair behind her ear or scrolled through her phone without looking up, I felt this tiny ache of distance. You know that feeling when you realize you've started watching your relationship from the outside? Like you're no longer in the scene, just observing it, trying to remember when it stopped feeling like home. That was me one Friday night. She came over after work. She brought a bottle of wine, that smile that could still knock the air out of me. And for a moment, everything felt normal again. We talked about work, our friends, the upcoming trip we'd been planning for months, a cabin getaway in Vermont. Then, as we were cleaning up dinner, she noticed my new headset on the desk again. You still use that thing every day? She teased. Yeah, I said, half smiling. I use it for calls, editing, gaming, basically everything. She rolled her eyes playfully. You and your tech. Sometimes I think you love gadgets more than me. I laughed softly, but the joke didn't land right. At least they don't break when people sit on them. Her smile faded. Still holding on to that, I didn't answer. She sighed and leaned against the counter. You really need to let that go, babe. I put down the dish towel. It's not about the headset, Emma. It's about you not caring that you broke it. That's what gets me. Her expression hardened. I did care. I just didn't think it was that deep. It was to me. She shook her head, muttering, You're exhausting sometimes. And there it was, that tone. The one that said I was too much, too emotional, too careful. To everything, I wanted to yell, to make her see it from my side. But I didn't. I just stood there in silence, listening to the faint hum of the fridge and the ticking of the clock on the wall. That was the first night she didn't stay over. The next day, I went for a drive, no destination, just open roads and my thoughts. Sometimes that's the only thing that helps me think. I drove past neighborhoods where people were mowing lawns, walking dogs, living uncomplicated lives. I envied that simplicity. I stopped by a diner off the highway, one of those classic places with chipped red booths and bottomless coffee. An older waitress named Carol asked if I wanted pie. I said sure, even though I wasn't hungry. While I ate, I overheard a couple arguing in the booth behind me. Their voices were low, but sharp, familiar. Something about who forgot what, who didn't listen, who cared more. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help it. Every sentence felt like a mirror held up to my own mess. When I got back to my car, I sat there with my hands on the wheel and whispered, Is this what love turns into? Quiet wars over small things. That night, I opened my laptop and scrolled through old photos of Emma and me. There was one from the summer, her sitting on my balcony, sunlight hitting her hair just right. Both of us laughing about something I can't even remember now. I looked happy in that photo. So did she. It's strange how happiness can feel like a snapshot. Something that existed once but can't be recaptured no matter how hard you try. I hovered my mouse over the delete button but didn't click it. Not yet instead. I opened my audio recorder again. I keep thinking about how easy it is to hurt someone without meaning to. I said quietly, We call it an accident so we don't have to carry the weight of it. But accidents still leave marks. It's not about blame. It's about acknowledgement. I stopped recording and sat in silence for a long time. 2 weeks later, Emma texted me, Emma, hey. We should talk. That's never a good sign. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind with acoustic music playing softly, and too many people pretending to write novels. She was already there when I arrived, stirring her latte, even though it was already blended. Her hair was tied back, her expression neutral. Hey, I said, hey. We sat in that weird limbo where you both know what's coming but pretend you don't see. She started, I feel like we've been off lately. Yeah, I said. We have. I don't know, it's like everything's heavier than it should be. Like we can't just enjoy each other anymore. I nodded. Maybe because when something breaks, I try to fix it, and you try to move past it. She frowned. You're still talking about the headset, aren't you? No, I'm talking about everything. She exhaled, leaning back in her chair. I'm not good at this, okay? At serious talks. At guilt, I don't want to fight over something small. But that's the point, I said softly. It wasn't small to me. Her eyes softened for a moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd finally see each other clearly. But then she said, maybe we just see the world differently, and that was the most honest thing she'd ever said. We didn't officially break up that day. but we both knew something had shifted beyond repair. The next few weeks were a slow unraveling. Fewer texts, shorter calls, plans that kept getting postponed, until one night, she came by to pick up some of her things. She looked around the apartment, the same space where we'd laughed, cooked, made plans for a future that now felt imaginary. When she saw the new headset on my desk, she smiled sadly. "Guess you don't need me to buy you dinner anymore." I smiled back, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Guess not." She hesitated by the door, like she wanted to say something, but instead she just said, "Take care, okay?" "Yeah, you too." And then she was gone. That night, the apartment felt impossibly quiet. I put on my headset, the new one, and sat at my desk. The audio was perfect, crisp, immersive, but it didn't sound the same. Maybe because silence isn't about the absence of sound. It's about the absence of someone. I opened my recorder one last time. "It's funny," I whispered. "People think love ends with a fight, or a betrayal, or some dramatic explosion. But sometimes it ends with a laugh that doesn't sound right, or a broken headset that no one takes responsibility for, or silence that grows louder every day until it's all you can hear." I stopped recording, sat there for a while. Then finally, I closed my eyes and let the silence have me. After Emma left that night, the apartment felt emptier than ever, but also sharper somehow. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was a reminder of the space she had occupied and the cracks that had formed between us. I found myself pacing through the rooms, looking at the traces she had left, the coffee mug she always used, the small stack of books she borrowed from my shelf, a stray hair that I hadn't noticed before. It was like every little thing carried her absence. I sat at my desk, the new headset perched on my head, the sound perfectly crisp, yet my mind was cluttered. I kept replaying the events, the tiny moments that had led us here. I realized relationships, like fragile electronics, accumulate stress over time. A laugh here, a careless word there, a broken promise somewhere else. All small fractures that eventually make the whole thing unstable. I started thinking about the headset again. Not the physical one, but the symbolism of it. How something so trivial in the grand scheme of life could reveal so much about how someone cares. Emma had laughed at it. She hadn't understood why it mattered to me. And in that laughter, I had heard something else, a truth I couldn't ignore. She never valued what mattered to me as much as I valued what mattered to her. I sat there late into the night, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at the screensaver glowing softly, wondering if this was the end or just another quiet chapter in our story. The following morning, I went for a walk. The streets were damp from an early drizzle, the city half awake and grey, but for some reason, it matched my mood perfectly. I walked past cafes and small shops, their windows fogged, steam rising from coffee cups in hands that were alive with morning chatter. I envied that liveliness, that oblivious energy. I felt tethered to a thought, a single thread of reflection that kept pulling me inward. Maybe love isn't about grand gestures. Maybe it's about the tiny, everyday acknowledgements of care, the small acts of repair and attention that we often overlook. Back home, I decided to catalogue the small things that mattered to me, not to obsess, but to understand. The headset wasn't just a headset. It was time spent, energy given, nights endured, moments shared with friends who were thousands of miles away, hours dedicated to learning, earning, surviving. And in breaking it, Emma had unintentionally revealed her priorities. It wasn't malice, not really, just a fundamental difference in how we approached life and responsibility. I opened my journal, something I hadn't touched in months, and started writing. The first line was simple. I am learning that love can be quiet and still broken all at once. I wrote about the headset, about the apartment, about Emma's laughter that no longer felt light. I wrote about myself, about the frustration of caring more than was safe. I wrote about the evenings I spent alone with my thoughts, the hum of the computer, and the small comfort of the new headset that could never replace the human warmth that had been there. Days turned into weeks. I kept myself busy with work, diving into projects, responding to emails, troubleshooting software issues for strangers who didn't know or care about my personal life. It was easier that way. Easier than thinking about Emma, easier than facing the truth that something fundamental between us had shifted. Even so, at night, the quiet would creep in, and I'd find myself staring at her old coffee mug on the counter, the one she'd left behind, and wondering if she ever thought about what she had left behind in me. One evening, I was cleaning the apartment when I found the receipt for the headset she had accidentally broken. I stared at it for a long time. $120. Not a fortune, but a token. And suddenly I felt the absurdity of it, how something so small could carry so much weight in my life, how a minor accident could reveal the truths of human nature and compatibility. I realized that love is often less about grand moments and more about the accumulation of small gestures, small considerations, the subtle ways we choose to notice and repair what we've broken. The next weekend, I decided to go through some old photos, pictures of Emma and me from the early days. Back when we laughed without thought, when the cracks hadn't yet formed. I noticed the difference in expressions, the subtle tension that had started to appear over time. Smiles that once felt genuine now looked strained in hindsight. Laughter that once felt light now sounded like an echo from a different room, one I no longer inhabited. I recognized a pattern. The more I looked for it, the more evidence I found of how slowly and quietly we had drifted apart. I kept thinking about how people handle responsibility differently, how some people see a broken object as a problem to fix, while others see it as a lesson to ignore. I realized that in life, we are constantly leaving traces behind, cracks, reminders, moments of care and neglect, and sometimes those traces tell the truth better than any argument or confession ever could. I began to see that the headset wasn't just about money or tech. It was a symbol of attention, care, and priorities, and it had revealed what words could not. At night, I started to record my thoughts again, as I had in part 1. Love, I whispered into the mic, is not what you say, but what you do, what you notice, what you repair. When one person laughs at what matters to the other, even in innocence, the fracture begins. I paused, listening to the faint hum of the computer, the soft click of the keyboard. I felt both lonely and enlightened, aware that some lessons arrive quietly, without drama, leaving a mark that is deep and unavoidable. Then one day, she texted again. "Can we talk?" The message was brief, neutral. I stared at it, feeling the familiar pull. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Part wanted to see if she had finally understood. I decided to meet her at a park near downtown, a quiet bench away from the noise. When I arrived, she was already there, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater, eyes fixed on the ground. I sat beside her, and for a moment, There was silence. No words, just the sound of the wind through the trees, distant traffic, the faint chirping of birds. She finally spoke. "I've been thinking about everything." Her voice was quieter than I expected. "I didn't realize how much that headset meant to you." "It's not about the headset," I said, carefully. "It's about understanding why something matters. About noticing. About responsibility, care." She nodded slowly. "I get that now. I just never thought about it that way. I didn't mean to hurt you." "I know," I said. "But sometimes it's not what you mean, it's what happens. And the quiet moments, they reveal who we are." She looked up at me, and for the first time in weeks, her eyes seemed truly reflective. "So, are we okay?" I took a deep breath, staring at the cracks in the pavement near the bench. "I don't think we can go back to being what we were. But maybe we can go forward differently, smarter, more aware." She smiled faintly, and we stayed there for a while, talking in fragments, laughing softly at old jokes, acknowledging our mistakes without blame. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't resolved. But it was honest. Walking home that evening, I realized that the headset had done something remarkable. It had forced a confrontation with reality, with love, with attention, with what it means to care. The object itself was replaceable, but the lesson it carried wasn't. I understood that some moments, no matter how small, echo far beyond their size, leaving behind a resonance that shapes the way we see people and ourselves. And as I stepped into the apartment, plugged in the new headset, and let the familiar hum fill my ears, I felt a quiet acceptance. Life, love, and the things we value, they break. Sometimes accidentally, sometimes through neglect, but the echoes they leave behind teach us more than the objects ever could. The apartment had grown quiet in ways I hadn't realized before. Even with the new headset plugged in, the familiar hum of the computer, the low buzz of my work calls, it all felt emptier. I kept looking at the desk, at the clean lines of the new device, thinking about the broken one, not because it was gone, but because of what it represented: care, effort, attention, small things that, when ignored, reveal deep truths about the people we share our lives with. In the days following that park conversation with Emma, I started to notice how little I had paid attention to myself in our relationship. I had always measured her responses, her attention, her care against my own expectations, which were high, yes, but grounded in my own sense of responsibility. The headset had been a symbol, yes, but also a mirror. It reflected how deeply I invested in things that mattered to me, and by extension, in the people I loved. I realized that the fracture I felt between us wasn't just about a piece of plastic. It was about fundamental differences, how we approached life, responsibility, and empathy. I began taking long walks again. Portland had a way of hiding beauty in mundane streets, in rain-soaked alleyways, in the smell of coffee mingling with wet asphalt. I walked with my thoughts, replaying conversations, imagining scenarios where things had gone differently. Sometimes I caught myself smiling at memories of her laugh, that wild, contagious sound, and sometimes my chest tightened, a small, sharp pain that reminded me I was still human, still attached, still capable of longing. I started journaling every night, not to relive the breakup, but to understand it, to untangle it from my sense of self. I wrote about the headset, yes, but also about other small incidents I had ignored. Times I felt unseen. Times I had compromised, times I had held back my own voice to avoid conflict. The more I wrote, the more I realized that love is not simply a series of grand gestures, but a collection of small, intentional acts. And when one person's acts or inactions continually fail to acknowledge the other, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Work became both a refuge and a test. I spent hours troubleshooting issues for clients who didn't know my life, who didn't care about my emotional world. The simplicity was oddly soothing. It reminded me that not everything carries hidden expectations, that not every interaction is laden with meaning or emotional risk. I felt the contrast keenly. My professional world was predictable, manageable, and under my control. My personal world had been chaotic, unpredictable, and sometimes painfully revealing. On one particularly rainy afternoon, I revisited the broken headset one more time. I held it carefully in my hands, turning it over, tracing the crack along the plastic. I could almost hear her voice, the careless laugh, the shrug, the dismissal. And for the first time, I felt neither anger nor sadness. I felt understanding, not empathy for her choices, but a recognition of truth. Some fractures cannot be repaired, not because anyone failed, but because we are fundamentally different in what we value and how we perceive care. I put the broken headset back in its box and tucked it on a high shelf. Out of sight, but not forgotten. It was a monument of learning, a reminder that care is not universally understood, that attention is a currency not everyone spends equally, and that silence can sometimes teach louder than words. I also started to notice other patterns in my life. I remembered small arguments that had been swept aside, minor frustrations that had never been voiced, moments when I had adjusted my own needs to accommodate someone else's comfort. The headset incident had illuminated a broader truth. In any relationship, small acts or failures accumulate. They form a narrative that cannot be ignored once it becomes visible. One evening, I decided to go back to the cafe where Emma and I had talked after the breakup. The same soft acoustic music played, the same hum of people pretending to write novels, the same warm light spilling across chipped wooden tables. I sat alone, sipped my coffee, and listened to the conversations around me. Couples whispered, friends laughed, strangers argued quietly. I realized that life moves on, regardless of whether we understand its lessons or not. People leave traces of themselves everywhere, some intentional, some accidental, and the echoes of those traces shape us long after they are gone. I thought about Emma, about the park, about the laughter, about the silence. I realized that I didn't want closure from her. I wanted clarity for myself. I wanted to understand the fracture, to see it fully, and to learn from it. And in that realization, I felt something I hadn't in weeks, a measure of freedom. Not joy, not happiness, not even complete peace, just clarity. Over the next few weeks, I continued my routines with renewed attention. I cooked more, even if I ate alone. I walked longer, noticing details in the city that I had ignored before. I reached out to friends, spent time with family, reconnected with people I had neglected while focusing on Emma. I started recording my thoughts more deliberately, narrating reflections, exploring emotions, sometimes reading them back aloud. The act of speaking and listening to myself became a kind of therapy, a way to process both grief and learning. At work, I noticed I approached problems differently. I was more patient, more deliberate. I noticed patterns in communication, small details in tone and word choice, the way people reacted to mistakes and responsibility. I realized that my approach to relationships mirrored my approach to work, care, attention, effort, repair. And while not everyone shared my values, that didn't make them wrong. It simply made them different. One night, I sat at my desk, headset on, music playing softly, and I imagined conversations I would never have, moments I would never share. I imagined Emma laughing, walking down streets far away, living life on her terms, and I realized I could wish her well without resentment. I understood that letting go isn't about indifference. It's about acknowledging the truth of a fracture without letting it define your entire world. In the quiet of the apartment, I started planning new goals for myself. Small, achievable things, completing projects, finishing a book, learning a new skill. I realized that the life we build after loss is made from small, intentional acts, much like the care we should have given before the fracture. I reflected on how love, attention, and effort must be matched with awareness and consistency. Without that, even small cracks can become chasms. The headset, once a symbol of frustration and difference, had become a teacher. It taught me about boundaries, about values, about my own capacity for patience and reflection. I realized that life's lessons often come disguised as accidents, as minor incidents that reveal deeper truths about ourselves and others. I could have been angry forever, bitter, resentful, or I could accept the truth, learn from it, and move forward with clarity. The city outside continued its rhythm traffic. Rain, voices, footsteps, indifferent to personal heartbreak. And in that rhythm, I found a strange comfort. Life moved on. Relationships left echoes. Small objects carried meaning. And sometimes, the smallest fractures leave the deepest lessons. I had begun to rebuild a sense of self that was independent of her presence. I understood that care, attention, and empathy were my responsibility, not a bargaining chip. I understood that some things break, some people leave, and some lessons arrive quietly. And I understood. Spring arrived slowly that year, rain turning to drizzle, drizzle to sunlight, sunlight to long, golden evenings. The apartment, once echoing with absence, now hummed quietly with life. I was rebuilding myself. I started cooking intentionally, not just grabbing leftovers or frozen meals, but preparing food with care, tasting, adjusting, noticing. The process became meditative. Chopping vegetables, listening to the knife hit the cutting board, stirring sauces. Every action was deliberate. It felt like small repairs, not just to meals, but to myself. I began reconnecting with friends I had neglected. Coffee dates, long walks, evenings spent watching old movies, sharing laughter without the weight of complicated histories. I realized how much I had insulated myself during the relationship, how much energy had been consumed by worry and care for another person, often at the expense of my own life. Now, I reclaimed that energy, noticing how the smallest gestures, a message, a check-in, a shared joke, rebuilt my sense of belonging. Work remained a refuge, but now I approached it with a different mindset. Tasks were still important, deadlines still critical, but the emotional stakes were mine to manage, not dictated by someone else's priorities. I started mentoring younger colleagues, teaching them not only technical skills, but also the subtle art of attention, the importance of noticing what matters. I realized that learning to repair isn't just personal, it's relational. We leave marks on people just as objects leave marks on us. Teaching care became a way to repair the world. Bit by bit, the headset remained on my desk, the new one, pristine, functional. I plugged it in often, for calls, gaming, and sometimes just to listen to music, podcasts, or even the quiet white noise of my own thoughts. Occasionally, I would glance at the old, cracked headset tucked away on the shelf. It no longer evoked frustration. It was a relic of growth, a reminder that even accidents can teach us lessons about responsibility, empathy, and self-respect. One afternoon, I found myself sitting at my balcony, notebook open, recording reflections for no audience but myself. I spoke softly into the mic. Repair doesn't always mean fixing what is broken in others. Sometimes it means understanding, adjusting, and rebuilding what is within you. I paused, letting the words settle, watching leaves sway in the wind, sunlight catching on droplets left from a morning rain. I realized that self-repair is as much about noticing the small details of our lives as it is about understanding our emotional fractures. I began intentionally creating small routines, morning walks, nightly journaling, weekend calls with my family. Each ritual became a thread in a tapestry of stability, a deliberate counterweight to the unpredictability of human relationships. It wasn't about controlling life. It was about caring for myself, noticing what mattered, and honoring it with attention and effort. Friends started noticing a change. "You seem lighter," one said over coffee. Another remarked, "You're more present." I smiled, acknowledging it silently. They didn't need to understand the intricacies of the headset incident or the quiet unraveling with Emma. They just observed the outcomes: clarity, focus, presence. I realized that repair is often invisible, its effects subtle, yet profoundly felt. One evening, I picked up my guitar, an old habit I hadn't indulged in since the height of the relationship. I played slowly, deliberately, noticing each string, each vibration, each subtle tone. Music, like life, required attention. Notes that were struck carelessly produced dissonance. Notes struck with mindfulness produced resonance. The metaphor was too clear to ignore. Love, care, repair, all demanded the same deliberate attention. I could not control others, but I could control my own actions, my own awareness, and the quality of attention I devoted to life. Time passed. Days merged into weeks, weeks into months. I started feeling comfortable in my own presence again. The quiet evenings no longer echoed with absence, but with reflection, with conscious awareness. I accepted that not all relationships are meant to be permanent, that some lessons are delivered through fracture and distance. I recognized that growth is rarely dramatic. It is cumulative, built in small acts of repair and attention. Eventually, I found myself thinking of Emma less with regret and more with acknowledgement. She had been part of my journey, a reflection, a catalyst. Her presence had exposed cracks, but her absence had allowed me to notice patterns, rebuild routines, and reclaim focus. The headset, once a source of tension, had transformed into a symbol of learning, that accidents reveal priorities, that care is a currency not everyone spends equally, and that understanding oneself is the first step toward meaningful relationships. In the months following, I began experimenting with new habits. I learned to meditate for a few minutes each day, to observe my thoughts without judgment. I started sketching, not for art's sake, but as a tool for clarity, for noticing the details that had escaped me before. I revisited old passions, reigniting the flames of curiosity and self-expression. Each act, however small, was a repair of my routines, of my emotional stability, of the attention I gave myself. Occasionally, I would receive messages from Emma, short, neutral updates about life, career, or mutual friends. I responded politely, but without emotional investment. I no longer required validation or apology. I had built a framework of understanding and repair within myself that was independent of her actions. It was liberating. One late night, after a long day of work and reflection, I sat at my desk, headset on, music playing softly, and recorded a final voice memo. Repair is not about undoing the past. It is about observing, learning, and intentionally shaping the present and future. We cannot control how others act, but we can control how we respond. We cannot demand empathy, but we can cultivate awareness. This is the work of repair. This is how we live. I stopped recording, smiled faintly, and let the quiet fill the room. The city outside continued its rhythm, lights flickering in the distance, traffic humming, footsteps echoing on wet pavement. And in that rhythm, I finally felt attuned. I had learned to repair not only objects, not only relationships, but the most important one of all, the relationship with myself, the broken headset. Once a source of tension and sorrow had become a teacher. Its crack was no longer a mark of frustration, but a testament to the lessons we learned from small fractures. Life, I realized, is composed of countless minor breaks, accidents, misunderstandings, losses, and our task is not to avoid them entirely, but to notice them, learn from them, and allow them to shape us into more attentive, reflective, and resilient beings. Spring turned to early summer, and with the longer days came a strange sense of renewal. I noticed the sunlight streaming through my windows differently now, warmer, softer, more deliberate, as if it was inviting me to step back into the world, rather than stay confined within the routines of my apartment. I had spent months repairing myself quietly, cultivating awareness, building habits that nurtured emotional resilience. But there came a point when I realized that repair alone wasn't enough. Life demanded engagement, not just reflection. I needed to open again, to trust, to connect, even if the cracks I carried remained. I started small. I went to local cafes more often, sitting with my laptop and notebook, watching people pass by. Observing strangers became a kind of meditation, the way someone laughed at a phone call, the way a barista remembered a regular's order, the subtle kindnesses that unfolded quietly, unnoticed. I realized that human connection wasn't always dramatic. It often existed in small, consistent gestures. One evening, a friend named Jake invited me to a small gathering at his apartment. Music, chatter, laughter, a mixture of familiarity and new energy. I was hesitant at first, worried about slipping into old patterns of overthinking or withdrawing. But as soon as I walked in, the warmth of the room pulled me forward. I smiled, greeted people, and realized how much I had missed the unpredictable joy of social energy. The spontaneity that I had shunned while dwelling on the past, it was there. Among strangers and friends that I met her, Claire. Not in the way movies suggest, dramatic and cinematic, but casually, over a shared joke about a playlist someone was curating. She laughed, a soft, unguarded laugh that caught my attention. Her presence wasn't overwhelming. It was curious, attentive, patient. We spoke about music, the local art scene, mutual friends, and I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Uncalculated connection. No expectation, no past wounds dictating the tone, just conversation flowing naturally. Over the next few weeks, Claire and I spent more time together. Coffee, walks, visiting local galleries, casual dinners. I noticed how different it felt to connect with someone new, lighter, less weighted by history, but not less meaningful. I recognized the importance of patience, of small gestures, of listening attentively. I approached this new connection with the lessons I had learned. Repair is internal first. Awareness comes before attachment, and empathy is cultivated deliberately. One rainy afternoon, we found ourselves in a quiet bookstore. She picked up a worn copy of a novel I loved, smiled at me, and said, "I think you'll like this." The gesture was small, almost incidental, but it resonated deeply. It wasn't grand or performative. It was mindful, attentive. I realized that these small actions were the essence of connection, the antithesis of the fractures I had experienced before. I also began reflecting on my own boundaries and patterns. The months after Emma's departure had taught me that self-care and awareness weren't selfish. They were essential. I could open to someone new without losing myself, without surrendering my capacity for attention and repair. I realized that vulnerability doesn't require abandonment, and connection doesn't demand erasure of past lessons. One evening, Claire and I cooked dinner together. Music played softly in the background, conversation meandering between work, childhood memories, and absurd hypothetical scenarios. The act of cooking side by side, chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, laughing when something spilled, felt profoundly intimate. Not because of overt romance, but because attention, presence, and care were tangible. Every glance, every shared laugh, every small gesture of help carried meaning. I understood that repair, when internalized, allowed me to recognize and cultivate these gestures in others. Fostering connection without anxiety or expectation, life outside my apartment began to feel richer. I attended a photography workshop, exploring streets of Portland with a camera in hand, noticing the details I had missed while consumed with reflection. Light, shadow, textures, fleeting expressions. I became attuned to subtlety, to the beauty in unnoticed things. Each captured frame was a small exercise in mindfulness, in seeing what others might overlook, echoing the lessons I had learned from the fractured headset and broken patterns of my past. One evening, Claire and I took a walk along the river. The sun was setting, painting the water in golds and oranges. We talked quietly about fears, ambitions, imperfections. I realized that this openness was new for me. I wasn't hiding behind routines, anger, or disappointment. I could engage fully with curiosity, patience, and awareness. The fractures of the past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer dictated my capacity to connect. They had taught me to repair first within myself, allowing space for genuine interaction with others. Sometimes I thought of Emma, rarely with bitterness, more with acknowledgement. She had been part of my growth, a mirror to my own patterns. I didn't need closure from her anymore. The lessons were integrated, lived. The headset, the laughter, the fractures, they had all become part of the architecture of my understanding, shaping how I approached relationships, attention, and care. Claire and I continued to explore connections slowly, deliberately. I noticed the difference between rushing toward someone for comfort and approaching with awareness. I noticed how listening attentively, noticing small gestures, and responding with intention fostered trust and warmth. I began to see that true intimacy is less about perfection or shared history, and more about mutual engagement, presence, and care cultivated daily. At home, I maintained my routines, journaling, walks, recording reflections, engaging with friends, and continuing my work with focus and attention. The balance was delicate, but I had learned to navigate it. Life, I realized, is a series of fractures and repairs. Objects break, people leave, mistakes happen, accidents occur. The key isn't to avoid these fractures, but to respond with awareness, to learn from them, and to approach the world with intentionality and care. The headset still sat on my desk. The old, cracked one tucked away on the shelf, the new one plugged in and ready. It was no longer a symbol of frustration or sorrow. It had become a teacher, a reminder that attention matters, that repair begins within, and that small gestures carry more weight than grand apologies. One night, as Claire and I watched the city lights flicker from my balcony, I whispered softly, more to myself than to her, "Repair is possible. Connection is possible. Love is possible when we learn to notice, care, and engage intentionally." She smiled, her hand finding mine, and I realized that the fractures of the past hadn't been erased, but they had been transformed into guides, silent teachers, showing me how to approach the present and future with clarity, patience, and openness. I understood then that life continues in its rhythm, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, sometimes broken, and that the true measure of growth is not avoiding fractures, but learning to repair, to notice, and to open again with intention. Summer deepened, bringing long golden evenings that stretched lazily into night. Claire and I had settled into a rhythm that felt both delicate and promising: coffee dates, gallery visits, quiet dinners, long walks along the river. But as much as I cherished this new connection, life, as it always does, presented small tests. These weren't dramatic betrayals or large conflicts. They were subtle, almost invisible, but potent enough to challenge the clarity and patience I had been cultivating. It started with the little things: a missed message, a forgotten plan, a casual remark that didn't land as intended. In the past, I might have internalized these incidents, allowed them to fester into frustration or resentment. But now, I noticed them immediately, observing both my own reactions and hers. The question wasn't whether something had gone wrong, it was how we responded to it. Awareness had become my compass. One evening, we had planned a picnic along the waterfront. I had prepared sandwiches, packed sparkling water, and brought a blanket. Claire arrived a little late, flustered, apologizing for traffic. Normally, my first instinct might have been irritation, a subtle reminder of her tardiness. But instead, I smiled, offered to set up, and listened as she recounted her day. Her lateness didn't feel like a fracture. It felt human, ordinary, and manageable. I realized that patience was not passive. It was active attention, a deliberate choice to observe without letting small cracks dictate the tone of the relationship. Later that week, another challenge arose. We attended a small dinner party hosted by mutual friends. Conversation flowed easily for everyone, except when a topic touched on past relationships. Claire was candid, and I noticed a flicker of unease in myself. The instinct to defend, to explain, to guard against judgment arose. But I paused, observing my own reaction. Instead of lashing out or retreating, I stayed present, listening. And in that space, I realized that trust isn't proven in the absence of tension. but in the ability to remain open and attentive when discomfort arises. During a quiet evening at home, we encountered a more personal test. A misunderstanding over a minor chore. Claire assumed I would take care of a small errand, and I assumed she would. Both of us felt overlooked, unappreciated. The old pattern of escalation lurked beneath the surface, a ghost from the past. But this time, I spoke calmly. I think there was a miscommunication. Let's figure out what went wrong. Claire met my gaze, nodded, and explained her perspective. We listened to each other fully, and the moment passed, leaving no residual tension. I realized then that repair in a relationship is ongoing, that empathy is not occasional but continuous, and that intention matters more than perfection. Outside these small domestic tests, I also reflected on my own growth. The months of repair and reflection after Emma had reshaped my inner world. I no longer measured love by sacrifice alone, or by how much I was willing to endure silently. I measured it by attention, presence, care, and the willingness to engage with honesty. These principles guided my interactions with Claire, allowing a gentle balance of boundaries, understanding, and shared effort. One Sunday morning, we took a trip to a nearby town, wandering streets lined with small shops and cafes. Claire picked up a delicate ceramic cup from a local artisan. "It reminds me of you," she said. I smiled, touched, not because of the object, but because of the thought behind it. It was an ordinary gift, but it carried intention, mindfulness, and presence. I realized that the fractures of the past, the broken headset, the misunderstandings, the unspoken disappointments, had prepared me to recognize the value of such gestures. They were small, but profound. Even work-life balance became part of the test. As I re-engaged with colleagues, projects, and deadlines, I noticed the ease of integrating personal awareness into professional environments. I could notice patterns, respond thoughtfully, and maintain calm in pressure situations. This skill, developed quietly in the aftermath of a broken relationship, reinforced my capacity for empathy and attention in all spheres of life. Over time, Claire and I shared deeper conversations. We discussed fears, past experiences, and aspirations. Unlike previous relationships, these talks were not shadowed by defensiveness or resentment. I could articulate my values, honesty, attention, care, without expecting her to conform, and she could share hers without fear of judgment. I realized that growth after a fracture is not about finding perfect alignment. It is about mutual willingness to engage with awareness, to notice, and to repair together where possible. One evening, I found myself reflecting quietly on the journey that had brought me here. I remembered the cracked headset, Emma's laughter, the early silences, the weeks of self. Each incident, however small or painful, had left an echo that reshaped my understanding of care, attention, and responsibility. I understood that love is rarely flawless. It is fragile, unpredictable, and easily fractured. Yet it is in the awareness of these fractures and the deliberate effort to repair and engage that true connection emerges. Claire and I continued to build our connection carefully. I observed patterns, her attentiveness, her subtle ways of showing care, the consistency of her engagement. I responded with patience, intentionality, and openness. We discovered that the quality of attention, rather than grand declarations, defined the health and depth of our bond. The broken headset, once a symbol of loss, had evolved into a teacher of subtle truths. Attention matters. Small gestures carry weight, and repair begins within oneself. By late summer, I felt a profound sense of alignment. The fractures of the past no longer dictated my emotions. They had transformed into guides. I could engage in love without fear of repetition, without projecting old patterns onto new experiences. I understood that healing and growth are not linear, that mistakes and misunderstandings will continue to arise, but that intention, awareness, and communication can sustain connection even through imperfection. One evening, sitting with Claire on my balcony, city lights flickering, a gentle breeze stirring leaves around us, I realized that I had come full circle. I had learned to repair myself, to notice what mattered, to cultivate presence and attention, and in doing so, I was now capable of nurturing a connection built on mindfulness, care, and mutual respect. The fractures had not vanished, but they no longer defined me. They had taught me the art of repair, the value of presence, and the possibility of opening again, fully, intentionally, and without fear. The headset rested on my desk, the old one tucked away, the new one humming softly. It had become more than a tool. It was a teacher, a symbol, a reminder of the journey from fracture to awareness. Life, love, and connection are composed of countless small tests, minor misunderstandings, and tiny gestures. The true skill lies in noticing them, responding with care, and allowing the lessons of the past to guide the actions of the present. I took a deep breath, Claire's hand in mine, and whispered softly, more to myself than anyone else. We can repair, we can engage, we can open again. And sometimes that is enough. She smiled, and in that smile, I felt the quiet confirmation of everything I had learned. Attention matters. Care is deliberate, and love imperfect, human, and fragile is worth the effort.